This shirt looks terrible on camera. If you're wondering why I always wear the same couple of shirts when I film these videos, yeah, partly it's because I'm as poor as a church mouse, but partly it's because the other shirts I own, they do not show up on camera. You see what hell it is to be a broadcaster. Anyway, as many as 3 or 4 people asked me to comment on the debate about veganism between Ask Yourself and Vaush. The vegan aspect isn't that interesting. Maybe the psychology of the left wing, the psychology of communists in the 21st century is a little bit more interesting to comment on. Here in just 3 minutes, you get a condensed version of what I think are the most salient elements of that conversation.
Just to be clear, are you actually saying that you think people would be morally justified to fund a Holocaust?
No, I would say that I do not know. We have to agree there are degrees of separation here. For instance, obviously, to kill a person, unjustified bad. To fund a person killing someone, unjustified bad. To buy a widget from a corporation that uses its funds to perpetuate like murder and such, it's bad, yes, but we've obviously removed. You wouldn't call that person a murderer. So the question really is whether or not there are enough degrees of separation between, say, right now the meat factory industry, the meat farming, or say slaves mining up lithium in the mines of Africa. If there's enough of a difference between me and them that I can't be held morally culpable.
Right, but the thing that I'm tripping out at, right, this is what's weirding me out about the position. So when we talk about that human Holocaust, you seem to say that, look, the best thing we can do is some kind of top-down action. So in the meantime, let's all support the Holocaust. I mean, I just don't understand why would it not
supporting the Holocaust? I'm just one of billions of human beings that have no choice but to participate in an unethical trade if they want to get something that they want. If they want to get something they want. And what I want often is meat or dairy. It's exactly the same as capitalism in this respect. This is the problem here, and this is the difference between, I suppose, I don't know, are you a leftist?
Politically, like, I kind of call myself a centrist, to be honest.
Well, this is the problem here. This exact argument could be made for capitalist industry, but the end result of making this argument is a society of people who blame themselves for not doing enough to oppose the selling power of unethical institutional forces. It doesn't work there, and I don't think it works for veganism. Don't you think that a broader, more efficacious solution would be approaching this top-down and just getting rid of corn subsidies and putting forward a meat tax so punitive that people can, at first, barely afford to eat meat more than, like, twice a month?
Right, so if you talk about some top-down approach where, for example, we just make it illegal something, that's about as effective as it gets, surely. But I don't know if my point came across, right? So I went to the extreme situation just to show that there is a case where you'll say that the action of the people makes a difference, right? And once you grant that, which I know you do, then you're also in a position where every step in that direction has the same kind of positive impact, just not to the same degree. And then it's your choice if you want to be a person who's making a step in that positive direction or who's just funding the Holocaust.
And the exact same argument could be made about purchasing commodities from a capitalist institution. They are identical arguments.
So I'm not even sure what I'm to take from that, really. Like, what are you trying to, like, drive at there?
The point that I'm making here is that as a leftist, I recognize that there are institutional benefits, not only to taking top-down approaches towards these problems, but also to rejecting proposed bottom-up solutions, because they can refocus blame and cause people to think that individual action can be a solution to institutional harm.
My mistake here is that I'm trying to talk about a complex, sprawling topic with focus and brevity. So this is going to be compartmentalized into a few statements on seemingly unrelated topics, but I swear there's one guiding thesis here. I spoke to a guy named Faraday earlier today. Faraday has a YouTube channel called Faraday Speaks. And at one point, he just said honestly, he felt hopeless about Western liberal democracy. He felt like Western liberal democracy is this unstable tinderbox, and it's either going to collapse into some kind of right-wing dictatorship or it's going to collapse into some kind of left-wing dictatorship. And of course, it's partly because he talks to people like this all the time. He talks to people like Vaush, communists, and then he talks to people on the right wing who are just as extreme and who seem to regard this society as tremendously fragile and about to be replaced by some kind of dictatorship at any given moment, a dictatorship that's going to carry out their fantasies. Now, yeah, I did say to him, I think reassuringly, this is just not so. And I directed him to look at real-world examples like Japan, real-world examples like Denmark, real-world examples like Switzerland. I said to him, look, Switzerland is not perfect. Switzerland is not paradise. But the point of politics, the point of a political order, is not to create paradise on this earth. It would be a tremendous accomplishment if the people of Florida had a system of government that works as well as the government of Switzerland. It would be a tremendous accomplishment if the people of West Virginia had the quality of education and health care that people have in Switzerland. It would be an amazing accomplishment if the people of West Virginia had preserved their indigenous languages the way Switzerland preserved their indigenous languages. They have universities for all the different languages than Switzerland. That's a real priority for them, unlike the genocidal USA, a topic for another video. People today do not seem to regard Switzerland or Japan or Denmark as inspirational. And they clutch at these fantasies of another world, of another life. In the Christian Bible, it says, our faith is not in things seen, but in things unseen. And the faith of the communist, in this same way, it's not a faith in the things of this world. It's a faith in this bizarre inversion of reality. And they cling to that faith so passionately that they don't want to let in any new ideas or any new information that'll challenge that faith, that'll upset their faith in this perfect order that can be brought about if only they have their terrible revolution, if only they replace democracy with a dictatorship that'll carry out their fantasies. So this guy Vaush is a bizarre illustration of that, where he says passionately that if he had his way, if his dictatorship of the proletariat took over government, if democracy is replaced with his dictatorship after a revolution, then he would carry out the vegan agenda. He would make meat illegal, or he would end the factory farming industry, or something like this. And he's so committed to this fantasy that the fantasy is worth more to him than the reality, the reality of the positive change you can make in the real world, here and now. And that positive change, it will never be as inspirational as the bizarre, surreal fantasy of what might be in some parallel universe or some revolutionary future. Take a step back here and draw your attention to a really strange absence in modern Western political discourse. Okay, why is there nobody in Parliament who is elected by the poor who speaks for the poor? It's not a new idea. Now, okay, some of you are going to say Bernie Sanders. No, Bernie Sanders speaks for one district in Vermont. That's not how it works. Bernie Sanders' job is not to speak for the poor. And that's why in the American system, House of Congress, or the British system, House of Parliament, there are no seats assigned for someone to represent the poor. In England, they have special seats assigned to represent Catholics. There are historical reasons for that. There was fear about the Catholics being persecuted and so on. It's the most obvious thing. And guess what? That's what they had in ancient Rome. In ancient Rome, they had tribunes who were elected to represent 5 classes of the plebs. So the plebs are remembered as the oppressed or disadvantaged class in Rome, in contrast to the patricians. But then the plebs themselves were split into 5 socioeconomic strata. So there's the richest of the rich, the poorest of the poor, and 3 other strata in the middle there. And each of these levels of poverty had tribunes assigned to them. As I recall, 2 tribunes for each level, so that's 10 tribunes, who were then elected. So the tribunes for the poorest of the poor were elected by the poor, and then they represented the interests of the poor, they advocated for the poor, they complained about whatever the poor had to complain about in Rome's Senate, in Rome's whole political system. It was much more complex than just the Senate. Not worth getting into. Okay, now, why do we not have this in any Western democracy today? The American system of government is nakedly an imitation of ancient Rome. That's why they call it a constitutional republic and not a democracy. There's a whole history there, okay? Why do we not have this in any Western democracy today? I'll tell you why. It's because left-wingers were too busy fantasizing about this revolution promised to them by Karl Marx. They were so deeply committed to this economic dream of a better world that's going to be brought about by these ridiculous methods I don't even want to summarize here. And there was no interest in the simple, humble, pragmatic reality of committing to making the positive difference that you can. Okay? And this is the difference you can make. All right? So this guy, Vaush, obviously, on some level, he wants to make the world a better place. Well, okay, Vaush, you might want to help people in Syria in the Syrian civil war, but you can't. The reason why veganism matters so much is that this is what you can do. This is the difference you can make, and you can make it with no tremendous personal sacrifice. You don't have to fly to Syria. You don't have to expose yourself to the danger of bullets and torture and arrest or something. You don't have to do much of anything. All you have to do is, when you go to the grocery store, instead of buying cow milk, you buy soy milk. Instead of buying a chocolate bar that has milk powder, you buy the chocolate bar that's dark chocolate that's vegan. I mean, everybody who's has lactose intolerance is already doing this. You make these small changes in your life, and this gives you an ethical position to advocate for the type of top-down legislative change you're talking about without being a complete and utter hypocrite. Doesn't that sound good? But tell me this. I mean, riddle me this. If you think the problem with Western capitalist democracy is that the poor don't have a voice in government, is that the poor don't have a voice in parliament, is that the poor are not heard by the elite who are in power, wouldn't the practical, humble, real-world solution to that be give the poor a voice in government? Couldn't you reserve 10 seats in the American House of Congress and say, these are the seats for the tribunes, these are the seats for the representatives of the poor? Would that be so hard to do? I've raised this in a different context. Why is it in the whole history of the United States of America you never had seats in Congress to represent the indigenous people, Native Americans, American Indians, whatever you want to say? Why couldn't you have some elected representation for the most oppressed people in the history of your country, so they at least have a voice, they at least have the ability to complain? And there are many other special classes of society who probably do need representation in government. This analysis may not end there. But if your ethical position is that the poor need a voice in government, why do you leap to this fantasy of destroying the government, destroying the economy, destroying all the fundamental assumptions of capitalism, to replace the government with a dictatorship of the proletariat? Why do you leap to that as opposed to solving the problem that was there in the first place? Giving the poor a voice in parliament, which could be done with a very simple reform with the stroke of a pen. England, Canada, the United States, Australia, all of these parliamentary democracies, they could have seats in parliament for people elected by the poor to represent the interests of the poor. And then those seats would be contested election by election. I really doubt that communists like Vaush would win those elections. I doubt it would be far-left people like you who'd get elected by the poor. As you know, sometimes the poor can vote in a very conservative fashion in many of these countries. But regardless, they would elect the people they wanted to represent their complaints and their concerns in Parliament. Okay? Who is it today who would stand up and give a voice to the animals in Parliament? Who is it today, when you're talking about ecology, who will stand up and give a voice for the trees? My country, Canada, was completely based on deforestation. The way government handles forestry, forest management, is they say, oh, here's a pie. Let's talk about how we're going to divide up the pie and make as much money out of it as possible. That's been the attitude of our country since it was a British colony. That's what we're built on, right? It's a very deep-seated attitude in government and in our elite ruling class. Many of the wealthiest families in Canada made their money out of cutting down trees. Many of them still do. Okay, there's still Domtar is still a huge corporation in the stock market, so on and so forth. All right. In Parliament, who is a voice for the water? Who is a voice for the air? Who is a voice for the trees? Many of these fundamental concerns are fundamentally not represented. They are, in effect, voiceless in a system of parliament that developed, truth be told, in England, just as a way of getting different tax-paying aristocrats together so that they could settle their differences and hand over all their money and horses to support the king before the king went to war. That's how parliamentary democracy evolved in the United Kingdom. It really wasn't set up to represent or even deal with broader social concerns, definitely not ecological concerns, so on and so forth. So there's a real reason here to call for reform in our political systems. But the mentality of the far left, the mentality of communists and people on the left wing, is to ignore every possibility for positive, pragmatic, down-to-earth reform, and to insist that no, the whole system is immoral, the whole system is a disaster, and the only way out is to have an even bigger disaster, to tear it all down and replace it with a grubby military dictatorship, their so-called dictatorship of the proletariat. Guys, Vaush illustrates how this commitment to revolutionary and authoritarian solutions to every problem, that's what he keeps saying, top down, up on, his commitment is exactly what makes the whole of the left wing so hard to convert to veganism, what makes it so difficult for vegans to find common cause with and collaborate with left-wingers and communists.